This is lecture number DR037LW03. This is the 37th of the Mega Genius Lectures and the 3rd of the Lost Wisdom series. It was recorded on 4 November 2010. The title of this lecture is Identifying Your Banzai Buttons. It is 36 minutes long. Copyright 2010 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
There is a particularly malevolent factor that every person encounters continually throughout his or her life, which is antipathetic to intelligent thought, making it an antagonist to the genius formula. I call that destructive influence the Banzai buttons. Explaining Banzai buttons is often upsetting to people. It stirs up unpleasant emotions which makes them uncomfortable. To explain Banzai buttons requires either courage or a cavalier attitude. I have both, so here we go. The word Banzai, literally meaning 10,000 years, referring to how long Japanese soldiers hoped that their emperor would reign, is short for Banzai charge and Banzai attack, phrases used by Allied forces during World War II to describe human suicide attacks by the Imperial Japanese Army. A button is a word or phrase or action that causes a person to feel uncomfortable, distressed, or upset. I define a Banzai button as a word or phrase or image or some other perception, object, or action that instantly causes a person's intelligence, meaning his ability to differentiate, to crash and burn. The trouble that a person gets into is that something sets off one of his Banzai buttons, and then he instantly violates the genius formula before he can even start to apply it. The Banzai button forces him to face certain thoughts, or more specifically, certain emotional considerations. Then, instead of perceiving more accurately, his emotional considerations induce him to add imaginary perception. Consequently, instead of being receptive to what really exists, he becomes unreceptive. He becomes unable to expand his attention and unable to examine thoroughly because he assumed something. Always because he assumed something. That is the imaginary perception. And he didn't even knowingly and willingly think about it. It happened automatically, just as if an unseen hand had thrown a switch in his mind. Do you see? A Banzai button automatically results in an assumption. Talk about something that is devastating to intelligent thought. I'll give you a few examples. One day I had a chance encounter in a remote part of this planet with a traveler who did not know me or anything about me. He did not know who I was, but we were chatting. He mentioned that he believed that he had lived in that remote area in an earlier lifetime. Now, the conviction that people live multiple lifetimes is not unusual. According to a 2008 Harris poll, 24% of Americans say they believe in reincarnation, and that percentage is rising. The belief is higher throughout much of the rest of the world. I replied to the fellow that a longtime friend of mine, a Christian minister, had recently confided something intriguing to me. Then, before revealing what it was, to give the fellow some background information about the minister, I told him, quote, I am not a member of the minister's congregation, but I know that he has preached at an evangelical United Brethren church for decades, unquote. Instantly the fellow jerked backward about a foot as though he had been yanked by some invisible force, and shouted, quote, "Oh, geez, evangelical, oh, geez, they don't have anything to say that, oh, geez," unquote. And then he walked away, sort of sideways, like a crab, as though the invisible force was dragging him. And that was the end of our conversation, him walking crab-like away, and me waving. Now, I could make a convincing case that there really were invisible electronic forces impinging upon him as a result of the considerations that he had about a Banzai button that was just one word, evangelical, meaning pertaining to fundamental Christian beliefs. Regardless, the fellow's space had collapsed, and he was no longer able or willing to communicate with me. He could no longer hold his space out and keep his attention expanded within it. Therefore, he was no longer able or willing to perceive what I was telling him. He was unable to examine the information. Do you see what happened? The fellow had instantly become unreceptive to perceiving anything that had originated from the mouth of an evangelical preacher, because the fellow assumed that it could not possibly be worthwhile. Although he was unaware of the genius formula, he had no chance of applying it, just because of that Banzai button. Just because of his considerations about a single word, the word evangelical. In other words, hearing just that solitary word powered up an old consideration that caused his intelligence to instantly crash and burn. Had he not had a Banzai button on that word, which therefore would have permitted him to maintain a reasonable level of perception, he would have heard me say this, quote, "I thought it was interesting that this elderly and extremely conservative evangelical minister, who had retired after half a century of preaching in the heart of America's Bible Belt, told me that both he and his wife were certain that people live in different bodies through numerous lifetimes. He said that he had never publicly revealed his conviction, only because he believed that too many members of his congregation would be too close-minded to accept it. So he had always thought that it was best to avoid upsetting them." Unquote. That's what the fellow would have heard me say. And it might have astonished him to learn that an extremely conservative Christian evangelical minister from the heart of America's Bible Belt was convinced of reincarnation. However, the fellow never heard me say that, because having encountered a Banzai button and having collided with his assumption that an evangelical minister could not communicate anything that could be beneficial to him, he had an intellectual meltdown, which was an idiotic thing for him to do. I'll give you another example of a Banzai button. Hopefully I'm not hitting one of yours. This Banzai button is the word smoking. Smoking causes lung cancer. Or so they say, but how do we know? How do we know? Well, everybody knows because, well, the U.S. Surgeon General said so, and because statistics, well, you can't fool people with statistics, and, well, it's a fact, and, everybody knows that it does. It's common knowledge, and it's been proven. It has been proven. Proof, of course, is merely evidence sufficient to convince. Proof is no more than that. In fact, there is a relationship between smoking and lung cancer, but not a direct relationship. Some people who get lung cancer have never spent much time around people who smoked, and many elderly people who have smoked for most of their lives never get lung cancer. So what is really going on here? I want to be clear about this. I am not promoting smoking, which can carry a risk that you may not want to accept. But smoking is merely a catalyst that can induce lung cancer in some people who are predisposed to contract that particular disease, much like ragweed pollen can result in hay fever if, and only if, one is predisposed to hay fever. Upon others, like me, ragweed pollen has no effect. It is the same concept as poison ivy or poison oak inducing a skin rash in certain people, but not in others, like me. But who differentiates to that degree? Certainly not someone with a Banzai button on the word smoking. Although the current President of the United States smokes cigarettes covertly, the U.S. Surgeon General, who is the leading spokesperson on matters of public health in the U.S. federal government, warns that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Incidentally, this is the same federal government that used to promote the safety of cigarettes by giving them to U.S. soldiers in their daily combat food rations. Our U.S. Surgeon General probably hopes that no one remembers that. Unfortunately for the U.S. Surgeon General, who incidentally is obese, I remember that. The U.S. federal government used to encourage smoking as part of its determination of what was healthy for Americans. Today, however, it discourages it, although I have never heard it announced that it had done an about-face, although it covertly had. Consequently, the easy road for the masses today is to have an intellectual meltdown on this issue too, and assume that the U.S. Surgeon General knows what she is talking about this time, and consequently believe that smoking causes lung cancer, and refuse to discuss the matter beyond that. And that conclusion is a reasonable one for any person of below average to average intelligence. However, it would be a conclusion of idiocy for anyone of extremely superior intelligence. I recall having a discussion in the early 1990s with a friend, an affluent and well-educated woman who had retired from teaching at the University of Maryland. She had also been a covert operative, a spy, if you will, with the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. She was well-read, well-spoken, and worldly. In the midst of our discussion about the Vietnam War, she mentioned that she and several others had been in the wrong place during that war and had been captured by the Viet Cong. They were led to a small clearing in the jungle where a Viet Cong officer was smoking a cigarette at a small table. Each detainee was ordered to approach the officer. The detainee then had 30 seconds to explain why he was in an area where he should not have been. If the officer believed the detainee's story, he would gesture to the right and the detainee would be allowed to escape by running in that direction, back into the jungle. If the officer did not believe the detainee's story, he would gesture to the left, and the detainee would be led just a few feet away, forced to kneel, and executed then and there with a bullet to the back of the head. When my friend was ordered to step forward, she quickly told the Viet Cong officer the cover story that she had been given by the CIA, which was that she was merely a housewife from the United States who was on an archaeological expedition and had become lost and disoriented. Incidentally, she was quite capable under normal circumstances of acting as though she had a hole in her dinghy, so the officer motioned to the right and the woman dashed into the jungle to freedom. My friend was a clever woman. Quote, "Well, I lived to fight the Viet Cong another day and I'm still here, but I'm sure that the Viet Cong officer died of lung cancer because he was a chain smoker," unquote. She adjudicated with a dart of her eyes, a furrowed brow, and a glowing Banzai button. "Not everyone who smokes dies of lung cancer," I interjected. She replied, "Yes, they do," and stared at me adamantly through the smoking debris of her irrational thought on that subject. Her Banzai button was the word smoking. People often have Banzai buttons on animals, insects, spiders, bats, cats, snakes, and the like. When another person whom I know spied a snake near her home, she had a conniption. She didn't even know what kind of snake it was, and she didn't care. It was a snake. She wanted it killed immediately. She summoned animal control services, the city police, and the sheriff's department. They all arrived. Her neighbors must have thought that she had cornered a vampire under her house. From her description, apparently she saw an eastern indigo snake, a docile and non-venomous reptile. In addition to eating rodents, which the woman probably would not have wanted near her house, eastern indigos have the ability to eat venomous snakes, such as cottonmouths, copperheads, and rattlesnakes, which I am certain that she would not have wanted nearby. Furthermore, eastern indigos are protected by state laws and have been listed as a threatened species by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act for more than 30 years, although their numbers are still declining. Eastern indigos are so jeopardized that it is illegal to handle or even harass one without a federal permit. Yet her entire objective was to have the snake killed. With a Banzai button on snakes, this woman had lost her ability to differentiate between a garter snake and an anaconda. She was a moron on the subject of snakes. In fact, the snake was able to differentiate better than the woman. It slithered away, and I'm sure avoided dwelling on the subject day and night for the following week, which is more than I can say for her. Do you see how Banzai buttons work? An accomplished scientist whom I know developed a Banzai button on the word television. He decided that there was nothing on television that he was willing to watch. Now, I don't mean that he had a Banzai button just because he chose not to make the time to watch anything. That was his choice. Rather, at the mere mention of the word television, he instantly became antagonistic and argumentative. He refused to consider the possibility that anything worthwhile might be broadcast. And if someone turned on a television set in his presence, he transformed into a wolverine on a bad day. Banzai buttons have 3 primary characteristics. First, they immediately fire up unpleasant emotions, like anger, rage, hostility, antagonism, fear, hysteria, or grief. That is the easiest way to recognize them. Things immediately become emotionally unpleasant. Second, you will always find an assumption where there is a Banzai button, and it will be that something equals something else. Evangelical minister equals nonsense. Smoking equals lung cancer. Snake equals danger. Television equals garbage. Third, Banzai buttons are always concerned with generalities. All evangelist ministers, all smoking, all snakes, all television, all black people, all white people, all rich people, all uneducated people, all educated people, all shorter than average people, all French people, all Mexicans, all New Yorkers. Banzai buttons can be words or phrases such as Nazis, bisexuals, immigration, illegal aliens, liberals, Republicans, conservatives, Democrats, taxes, abortions, police, spiders, cats, feminists, Jews, drug dealers, crimes, religions, insects, molestations, lobotomies, deaths, funerals, banks, politicians, obesity, hypocrisy, insurance companies, gambling, or terrorism. Or they may be images or smells or tastes or almost anything. I know a woman who, upon hearing the word coconut, which she identifies with a taste that she despises, ignites like a Saturn V multi-stage rocket. Just by hearing the word. That's what a Banzai button does. Besides words, images, smells, or tastes, Banzai buttons can be people, organizations, animals, ideas, or anything else. But a Banzai button, regardless of what it is, will short-circuit a person's ability to differentiate, instantly knocking at least 50 points off his IQ. Banzai buttons can be effectively addressed. For example, the fellow who was nearly homicidal at the mention of the word television discovered later that he enjoys watching some documentaries and sports. He finally began to differentiate about television. A friend of mine used to criticize celebrities. He continually complained about them. He grumbled, "They always act so unfriendly. They're never willing to talk. They're just not nice people." He had the antagonistic emotion, the careless assumption, and the attitude of generalization. It was all there. He had a Banzai button on the subject of celebrities. One day in an upper-class section of Los Angeles, he and I stepped into a men's clothing store. Almost immediately, the comedian Robin Williams walked by him, and my friend rolled his eyes, meaning they're always so unsocial. Yet the attitude was all in my friend's mind. A couple of minutes later, in the store, an unshaven and informally dressed customer briefly commented to my friend about some item of clothing that was for sale. Then my friend darted toward me as though he had been panhandled by a leper, effusively urging between clenched teeth, "Let's get out of here soon. There's a bum over there." Well, a few minutes later, after the bum had bought something and left, a store clerk who had noticed my friend's reaction showed him the check that he had received from the unkempt fellow. The bum, who was changing his appearance for a role, was the acclaimed American actor Richard Chamberlain, who had gained fame on television as Dr. Kildare and performed the title role of Hamlet with the Birmingham Repertory Theatre in London, a role that he had later reprised for television in the Hallmark Hall of Fame. Of course, I then pointed out to my friend that it was not the celebrity who was discourteous, but rather it was he who had acted unfriendly and snubbed the celebrated Shakespearean actor. Soon thereafter, just to drive my point into the bone, I introduced my friend to Beatrice Arthur, the Tony and two-time Emmy Award-winning actress best remembered for her role in the television series All in the Family and Maude, and in The Golden Girls. B, a dynamic and authoritative actress who towered physically above my friend and whose voice was an octave deeper than his, inadvertently intimidated him. But then, just for fun, having realized what she had done, she adopted a particularly affable attitude as she prodded him to talk, but he was speechless. Never again, though, did my friend complain about celebrities being unfriendly. I knew another fellow whom I'll call Roger. He could not drive a car through Rapid City, South Dakota in the United States. Each time that he tried, his car, regardless of what car he was driving, broke down. Finally, Roger tried again, but he just knew something was going to go wrong. Miraculously, however, he made it. Roger couldn't believe it. For the first time in his life, Roger had successfully driven through Rapid City, South Dakota. Then, at the outskirts of the city, his engine suddenly sputtered and stopped, and his car silently rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the highway just a few feet outside of town. Then Roger shouted, "I knew it. I just knew this was going to happen. It always does, right here in Rapid City." Roger looked under his car and saw cherry-red transmission fluid dripping to the pavement, which upset him even more. Transmission work would be expensive and time-consuming, and it was imperative that Roger be in Minneapolis, Minnesota the next day. Roger had his car towed to an automotive repair shop where every minute counted. There he waited for 3 excruciating hours until a mechanic who had been working on police cars was able to get to his vehicle. Finally, Roger was presented with an estimate for $2.59, which was even less than the cost of a loaf of bread. Roger was stunned. There was not even a charge for labor, just $2.59 for a gallon of gasoline. Roger had run out of gas. The dripping red transmission fluid was just the result of his car having been in gear as it rolled to a stop. You see, because Roger had developed a Banzai button on Rapid City, South Dakota, he could no longer think intelligently while driving through it. Accordingly, his emotion of apprehension had distracted him from watching his gas gauge. Consequently, his car had broken down again, just as he had known it would, but only because he had a Banzai button on Rapid City, South Dakota. So, the 10th idiocy that can interfere with your ability to apply the genius formula effectively is Banzai buttons. You need to address considerations that block your willingness to give and receive communication, that stop you from expanding your attention into certain areas, that prevent you from examining closely, or that are otherwise impinging on you and shaping your life to your disadvantage. There are various ways to neutralize your Banzai buttons, but first you must identify them. Spot the specific words or phrases that instantly make you feel angry, or antagonistic, or hostile, or fearful, or sad, or apathetic. The act of identifying your Banzai buttons will diminish their power. Reviewing all your considerations about each of your Banzai buttons will weaken them further. Remember, an open mind is the key to understanding, and a closed mind is the hallmark of ignorance. To the degree that you can expand your attention, examine your life, and spot your Banzai buttons, which automatically turn on assumptions that close down your ability to perceive and differentiate, you will be using the genius formula to increase your intelligence. Now let's look at some positive approaches that you can take to increase your ability to apply the genius formula effectively. Consistent application of the formula is a gradual learning process because it is foreign to the way that most people think normally. You should apply the formula gradiently to improve your intelligence. Do not try to immediately jump all the gradients and right away apply the formula perfectly. You should be practicing it by noticing when you are not noticing things right before you, by noticing when you are not examining things right in front of you, by noticing when you are making assumptions. Don't try to build London in a day. Just build better streets, one cobblestone at a time. Now there's an old saying, don't change what works. And that is a helpful saying, which has been around for a long time, and which many people have violated and lived to regret. They would have been better off if they had not changed what worked. So the adage is, don't change what works. That needs changing, though, because it isn't the best advice. If people had not changed things for the better that worked, we would still be using the telegraph, the phonograph, and steam-powered automobiles. A saying that reflects more wisdom would be, think twice before changing what works. The flip side of the old saying would have been, change what doesn't work. Now that would have been a terrific adage, although I've never heard it said. A couple's marriage is deteriorating. A student's grades are dropping. A restaurant owner's clientele is decreasing. A person's health is weakening. A grandparent's eyesight is worsening. A man's hair is thinning. A woman's money is diminishing. What can the person be certain that he or she must do? Well, he generally doesn't have to do much of anything if the situation is relatively minor. If he's caught a cold, he should be over it in a week, whether he takes some medication for it or not. You don't need to take out a dandelion with a flamethrower. What needs to be done, however, if the married couple has refused to speak for 2 weeks, or the student's grades are dropping significantly, or the restaurant owner's clientele continues to drop, or the person's health is not improving, or the grandparent's eyesight continues deteriorating, or the man's hair is falling out, or the woman's financial situation is not recovering? The answer is something. he has to change something. And he had better make the change quickly, because the situation that exists doesn't work. Even if he doesn't know the right thing to do, he should know that the wrong thing is to do nothing. People make this mistake as easily as eating cookies. Emma has a successful cookie shop. In July, she is not selling as many cookies as she was. She waits for August. That month, she sells fewer cookies. In September, her sales continue to drop. She hopes for the best in October. By then, Emma no longer has a cookie shop. Change what doesn't work. If some important facet of your life is not going well, and if it does not resolve quickly, the intelligent actions are to expand your attention throughout the matter, examine it closely, and do not assume that the condition will improve on its own. Change something. Here's another tip. In retrospect, at any time and in any situation, how do you know if you applied the genius formula adequately? You know that you did because the matter that you addressed worked out right. Obviously, then you applied the formula adequately. And if it did not work out right, then a warning bell should have rung. Red flag should have waved, and a 100 decibel siren should have wailed, because you discovered a gold mine, which was some facet of your life about which you are dense. A defect in your intelligence. What a golden opportunity. Every mistake is a gift. Any time that you are surprised or fooled or startled or realize that you have misjudged something or someone, or learn that you have made a mistake of any kind, you have erred in applying the genius formula. Therefore, look over the matter and determine how you violated one or more steps of the formula. By repeatedly realizing how you did not apply the formula correctly, you will gradually strengthen your ability to apply the genius formula effectively and consistently. If you find that the expensive winter sweater that Aunt Amanda Lynn gave you for your birthday, which you packed away last spring, is riddled with moth holes, realize that you neglected to expand your attention to the label. Or maybe you failed to examine the label closely enough to learn that the sweater is made of wool, which may need special protection. Or maybe you never expanded your attention to and examined a source of accurate information about protecting clothing stored with cedar wood balls, or a camphor product, or some other insect repellent. Or maybe you merely felt the sweater and assumed that it was made of acrylic fibers that would need no special protection. Or from the looks of the moth-eaten sweater, maybe you never thought intelligently about it at all. Maybe a gun-wielding robber held you up and demanded your money or your life, and you decided to think about it. If you got shot, maybe your attention was too dispersed to notice his weapon, or maybe you failed to see that it was real. Maybe you assumed that he would wait patiently while you mulled over his order. You only make mistakes because of lessons that you have not yet learned thoroughly. Maybe you decided to bounce on a trampoline in an electrical storm, or ridicule the mafia, or poke a hippopotamus with a stick. Incidentally, don't do those things. I once saw a man who was standing behind a wild zebra try to pet it on its rear end. That was in the zoo in Salt Lake City, Utah. He won't try that again. But whatever you did, if it was a mistake, whether minor or major, you have a priceless opportunity to look back and, 1, discover how you failed to apply the genius formula, and 2, just by recognizing that failure, correct a defect in your intelligence, and 3, thereby increase your intellectual capacity. To make as many correct decisions as possible, make as few mistakes as possible, not only by using the genius formula to avoid making them, but by noticing each mistake that you have made, and then by noticing how your failure to follow the formula resulted in that mistake. If you look over various mistakes that you have made each time with the intention of determining how you violated the genius formula, you should notice some pattern of having violated one part of the formula most often, or of having violated it in the same manner frequently. If not, then just keep looking over your mistakes, troubles, and problems until you do see a pattern. Then, having found it, ask yourself this question: how many of those same mistakes, troubles, and problems would I create again in the same manner? I should think that your answer would be this: very few, because I now know how I caused them by violating one or more parts of the genius formula. And since I know how I caused various mistakes, troubles, and problems, I am now aware of how to avoid creating them. Of course, that degree of awareness reflects an increase in your intelligence. In the next lecture, I'm going to reveal how you can not only use the genius formula to greatly accelerate your thought processes, but like a supersonic jet, cut in your mental afterburner.